Good morning and welcome to chapel this morning. We're happy to have you worshiping with us. Special thanks to the Chicago Justice Journey for their reflections this morning, their leadership and hospitality, and special thanks to Anna, Kate, and Britt for their messages this morning. Please rise for the greeting. With thankful hearts, we gather as one in our gathering, feasting, and dancing. Amen.
Today's reading comes from Psalm 139. Lord, you have searched me out. O Lord, you have known me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You trace my journeys and my resting places, and are acquainted with all my ways. Indeed, there's not a word on my lips, but you, O Lord, know it altogether. You encompass me behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain to it. Where can I go then from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I climb up to heaven, you are there. If I make the grave my bed, you are also there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will cover me, and the light around me turn to night. Darkness is not dark to you, the night is as bright as the day. Darkness and light to you are both alike. For you yourself created my innermost parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I will thank you because I am marvelously made. Your works are wonderful, and I know it well. Word of God, word of life.
Thanks be to God.
I apologize, I've been a little sick, so if I lose my voice a little bit. Okay. One of the first experiences on the interfaith justice journey was Trinity UCC Church in Chicago. We were walking towards the church, finding banners exclaiming that they were unashamedly Black and unapologetically Christian. Going into the church, I didn't really know what to expect. It saddens me to say this fact, but this was going to be one of just a few times in this country where I was very visibly the minority. We walked into the church to find a joyous, vibrant, and exuberant worshipers. Certainly different than the Lutheran services that I'm used to. When I found my seat, I saw these shining brown eyes with a cute, shy smile. A little while into the service, this boy became more comfortable with me sitting next to him, and he told me his name. It was Malachi. This sweet, precious boy couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Throughout the service, we began to form a bond by clapping and holding hands together throughout songs and prayer. This was only the beginning of this boy leaving an imprint on my heart. The time came for the sermon. The title in the bulletin was Black Lives Matter. I was expecting it to be addressed to the entire congregation as a whole about how they could band together against the oppression their community has been facing. However, the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III took a more individual approach to Black Lives Matter. He spoke about how could people demand for others to say their lives matter if they don't even believe it themselves that their lives matter? He referenced Psalm 139 and began to lift up the congregation by reminding them that they were fearfully and wonderfully made. Then the whole congregation together shouted, "I am fearfully and wonderfully made." The Reverend Doctor also called upon everyone to look at the person next to them and say, "You matter." There I was, looking at little Malachi, exclaiming, "You matter." I said it with all my heart, "Malachi, you matter." But inside, deep down, I was still struggling. Looking in these boys' eyes, I couldn't help but think about the sad truth that there are people out there who will write this boy off and say that he's not significant because he is a young Black male. There he was, a beautiful child of God who was fearfully and wonderfully made. Yet there are other children of God, his fellow brothers and sisters, who believe he doesn't matter. My constant prayer is that Malachi grows as he grows older and begins to encounter the harsh realities of the world we live in, that he never forgets that he matters, no matter what others believe or say. I think back to that moment with Malachi often. This experience has called me to act. It seems quite daunting to work to ensure that everyone is seen with value and worth by society, regardless of religion, race, or class. But I believe first it takes the little things, looking at people and thinking to myself, they matter. Then making sure that people actually know for sure that they matter. Now, right now, I want you to look at the person next to you and say, "You matter." Now, as you go out today, continue to do that. Silently or shouting it out, say to all human beings, "You matter."
Hello. I'm also a little under the weather, so if my voice does weird things, I apologize. One of the later stops on our trip, we went to the Sikh Gurudwara in around the Chicago area, and that was very interesting. I had no clue that the Sikh community existed. I, like many Midwestern white people, thought they were also Muslim, which they are not, and that was a very interesting experience to have. But it was such a welcoming experience. Like, we got there early, we were greeted by these two wonderful people who helped us, like, show us where we take off our shoes, helped us prepare our heads, because in the Sikh tradition, everyone covers their head. And we got a tour of their holy place. And one of the great things about the Sikh tradition is after every service, they prepare a meal called the langar, and we got to tour their kitchen while they were preparing this meal, and it was very interesting for me. I've had many different religious backgrounds, all of them Midwestern, and some of like my favorite memories in church have been like the big potlucks where there's food and everybody's preparing things, and you have the fathers setting out the table and the mothers cooking things in the kitchen, and it was very similar to that with some differences. Everyone in the Sikh tradition helps to prepare the langar. So there were these wonderful mothers who clearly know exactly what they're doing, rolling up balls of dough and flattening them out to make bread. And then there were these adorable, like, 2-foot-high children who are sitting there after the bread has been cooked by all the adults on the flat top, and are buttering each of them individually and carefully making sure that every part is covered. And it was a wonderful reminder to me that we all come from different religious backgrounds and we have different traditions, but there's this sense of community that is very welcoming, and everyone is able to come and join. And that was just a wonderful reflection for me to see that in the Sikh tradition, but also like in that be able to recognize it in my own religious traditions and what it would look like. I mean, you don't entirely see the world that you're living in until you step out and go somewhere else. And then it was just realizing how much food and community had a great part to deal with in like my religious tradition and my church. One of the interesting things about the langar is it is served with everyone sitting down. So everyone sits down on the floor in a line, and this is a very interesting and very rebellious tradition, actually, within the Sikh tradition, because the Sikhs historically were in a place where there was fighting between the Hindus and the Muslims, and no one of different religious backgrounds would ever eat with one another. That was unthought of, actually somewhat illegal in some places. And it was only in the Sikh temples during langar where everyone sat down equally and everyone was served a vegetarian meal, because not everyone can afford to have meat, so it was a very equalizing thing. And we, as a Justice Journey, got to participate in the langar and be served, and it was a wonderfully humbling yet welcoming experience to sit on the floor like a 5-year-old and look up at these tall adults who are like, "Do you want this food?" And I'm like, "Yes, please, I would like food. I feel so short and small, but yet somehow you want to feed me." This is an amazing experience, and if you ever feel like going out of your comfort zone, all people are welcome in the Sikh langar, so I would suggest it. But one of the great things that I took away from this experience is how much we can welcome people and how much food and community plays an important role in any religious tradition. And so I'd kind of challenge you to think about your religious tradition and how food or community plays a part in that, and how you can help welcome other people, but also help to just create a welcoming environment for anyone in your religious tradition. So.
Good morning. One of my friends introduces himself as a theology major, and he doesn't attend Concordia, which is why. But this affects how people perceive him, and therefore how the conversation that he has with others play out. So many people respond, and they know once they figure out what theology is, because a lot of people forget. They explain that they went to church last Christmas or defend their view of God and then exit the conversation. Or they assume that his theology is Christian and then they become defensive. And a few of them do get into thoughtful conversations, but just as often the conversation just falls flat. And I always thought it was really cool that he can get into so many religious conversations just right off the bat, just by saying, "Hi, I'm so-and-so," and they're like, "What are you majoring in?" "Well, theology," and there you go. But unfortunately, so many of the conversations also turn out negative. And so when we decided to go on our Justice Journey trip, I was very excited for the introduction, for being able to say, "Hi, we're from Concordia College, and we are here on an interfaith trip." And this introduction caught people's attention. I like to think that it said that we were there to learn about others, to listen, to have open minds. And people did respond differently than they do to my major. I'm an English major, very different conversations. But they didn't get defensive, and they repeated over and over, "What have you learned so far?" But we didn't have to elaborate much on the things that we had seen before people would start telling us their own stories, and so we listened. And this trip was, to me, an experience in learning how to approach people who are different from myself, and an experience in talking about our differences rather than ignoring them. As a white female, my story is fairly well known and represented in the media, so what I learned to do was to start the conversation and then to listen. And there were structured parts of the trip where we were let into worship spaces and participated in worship, and then we were given guided tours. And I learned a lot in these settings, and I expected to, especially once I learned that we had given donations to most of these places as well. So they were very gracious and willing to host us, but they also possibly felt an obligation to do so. But what struck me were the reactions of people who felt no obligation to us. We met and introduced ourselves, and they chose to prolong the interaction and chose to be heard. This happened at the church that Anna spoke about. It was after the service, and we were all just gathered and eating fried chicken. We were unable to get into this extra service or extra conversation that we had been hoping to get into. So we were just grabbing a bite to eat before heading out. And there was this woman sitting next to me, a church member, and she was very willing to have an extended conversation with me about what the church's outreach ministries were. And this happened again after we joined the Muslims for their Friday noon prayer. We stood in the parking lot afterwards, and a couple learned that we had been in their prayer with them but hadn't received a tour or anything formal like that. And so they stood there and answered all of our questions that we might have, and hundreds of people left and the parking lot, and we were still standing there, and finally they kind of dismissed us, and that's when the conversation ended. And this happened again at a lakeside outlet mall. We happened upon a stall with scarves and little Indian, specifically Hindu and Buddhist figurines. We were trying to identify a couple of them, and the seller, a Hindu woman, not only happily explained the figurines to us, but then she described her own spirituality. And she believes that her religion celebrates the same greater power that Christians recognize, even though what I see is a representation of dozens of gods. But her Hindu faith is expressed in a very different way. But she believes that it celebrates the same thing. So my conclusion is that the approach matters. The introduction matters. What my Christian upbringing identifies as religious differences, I now understand to be mainly cultural differences. And that's okay. It's interesting, and it's worth listening to. So I hope to keep introducing myself in an open way, not by saying I'm on an interfaith trip, because the trip is over, but perhaps by saying that I'm a student of the world around me, or something like that. But hearing another person's story is interesting, and learning to understand their differences are priceless. This is what demonstrates an open mind, and it invites conversation and understanding. And to me, that's what an action of interfaith is.
Our second stop on our justice journey was to a Tibetan Buddhist monastery. We were kindly welcomed, and before we left, 2 monks were willing to chant for us. So we would like to share that experience with you now. You will hear 2 minutes of a chant that includes a singing bowl, monks chanting in the background, and throat singing. And so it's similar to what we heard, so we would like you to listen to that. So use this time to listen, sit in silence, meditate, pray, or however else you would like to use this time.
our way continues in peace.